Lauda and Indol Sengupta. This is a perfect moment to discuss France with Carpentier de Gourdon. This is a moment when in France, the president, the former president, very high-profile former president Nicolas Sarkozy has been sent to prison. What impact does this have on France and its politics, and indeed in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world? To discuss all that, Carpentier, welcome.
Hello, greetings to all, and greetings to you, Hindol.
Thank you very much. Let's begin, by talking about Nicolas Sarkozy, the man at one point very, very highly influential, of course, an extremely, in a sense, outgoing, popular, would you say popular president? And seeing him being sent to prison seems like there's something dystopian going on.
Well, this story has been brewing for a long time because Sarkozy was already tried and found guilty in a previous case involving corruption over election funds. And as a result, he was barred from exercising any public office and was wearing an ankle bracelet to trace his movements. He had to report once a week to the police station. And so he was technically already a convict, if you want to call him that way. But then the latest case is bigger because it involves a massive case of corruption linked with Libya and former Libyan strongman, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, with whom, as a politician, Sarkozy had dealings. And it seems that he did. I'm not going to go into the details because there is still some controversy, but the justice system has found him guilty of accepting a huge contribution from Libyan funds, which was apparently used to finance Sarkozy's electoral campaign. And we know later that Sarkozy turned against Gaddafi, spearheaded the EU, NATO, I'm not quite clear. It wasn't the EU, it was NATO, but it was not all NATO. It was primarily France and Italy, backed by the United States and Britain, that decided to carry out regime change in Libya. They alleged that there was a massive insurrection and that there would be a genocide because Gaddafi's troops would kill the protesters and the insurrectionists, the rebels. So they decided to launch an aerial invasion or an aerial bombing campaign, which was then involved some ground troops, particularly special forces from Qatar and other states. And of course, that led to the de facto breakup of Libya and the death of Gaddafi in rather gory circumstances. And there was a claim that French special forces were involved, including, by the way, in Gaddafi's killing. Now, this, of course, it was very, not only embarrassing, but it was extremely sordid because it suggested to many that Sarkozy might have had an interest in eliminating Gaddafi so that he wouldn't speak about the previous financial dealings between them. But a lot of people have spoken because obviously these kind of transactions are not completely secretive. You know, some people were involved both on the Libyan and the French side. So they spoke about it. And obviously Sarkozy was a very tainted character, both from his previous political life and also from his connections with Libya and with what we call broadly in France, France-Africa, you know, which is a sort of rather underhanded, under the table political and economic dealings that take place between French politicians and African heads of state, having to do with the old French colonial presence in Africa and enduring links on a personal level, where France basically picks some of the leaders that it wants to have in the friendly African countries. And obviously it does support them. And when they fall, very often gives them protection. We have seen the latest case just a few days ago was in Madagascar, where the president who had been overthrown by a popular insurrection backed by armed forces, he was exfiltrated by French special forces. And interestingly, it sounds like just in this recent instance, Sarkozy, although he was a disgraced former president, he personally telephoned President Macron and asked him to make sure that the Madagascar head of state, deposed head of state, or at least head of state on the move, on the run, should be exfiltrated and sent to a safe place, which happens to be United Arab Emirates. And it appears that Macron went along with Sarkozy's request, probably because there were some political and financial transactions that the French state didn't want to see come out in the light. Therefore, there must have been some reason, because Sarkozy became quite close, or at least quite, I would say, friendly with Macron in the last few years, primarily for trying to attain personal protection, because he felt that his own party, the Republicans, the center-right party in France, was not really supporting him, and therefore he had to find some backing from the Élysée, from the presidency. However, the French judicial system is traditionally leaning to the left and has very poor relations with Macron. Therefore, even though justice in France, as in most other countries, is heavily politicized, the fact is that for some reason there is a tug of war between the judicial and the current executive authority, which means that Macron would not or could not protect Sarkozy, and therefore Sarkozy has been sentenced to 5 years in prison.
The interesting thing in all of this, Combe, is two things emerge immediately. Number one, the Macron government is already quite beleaguered. Not a week passes when there isn't discussion in the global press about the future of the Macron government and what's really going on there. France has seen, a change in government, a change in leadership again and again in recent years. And of course, there have been protests and so on and so forth. The whole situation certainly is quite tumultuous. The other thing is that it really seems like Europe can, in some senses, never entirely break away from its old colonies. This old colonial hangover continues on and on and on, even though on every platform colonialism is denounced. But, neither Britain nor, countries of Europe seem to be able to overcome this. This legacy, in a sense, in quite dark ways, as you were explaining, continues.
Yes, I think that's a constant in history. If you look at the Roman Empire, to mention only one empire, it took centuries for countries that had been under Roman rule to gradually sever their connections with the seat of the Roman Empire, which was obviously the Italian peninsula. And that's one reason why Italy kept a commanding presence in the Catholic religion for centuries. And right until the 17th century, all the official documents and official meetings were held in Latin. And that shows that the Roman presence, backed by the Christian faith, was extremely enduring. And it's only with the advent of the Age of Enlightenment and then subsequent phenomena that you could see a distancing. So think of it, it's almost, well, I would say more than 1,000 years for an influence like that to gradually fade, although it remains culturally enforced. So you see, the same obviously is happening with Africa, Latin America, and Asia, where the linguistic, institutional, political, and financial bonds remain very strong. And that's why you can expect French-speaking Africa to remain connected in some way to France, even if it's a frenemy relationship, as it is now. For example, there is a sense that Madagascar, for one, is the latest country in Africa which is probably trying to shift away from France and move towards China and Russia to an extent, which has been the case for at least half a dozen African countries in the last 2 or 3 years. So there is, of course, that shift. The most impressive one is the Algerian shift, which has become increasingly inimical to France, to the point where the Algerian government talks about replacing French with English, which would be, of course, a real sacrilege. But this shows that there are countercurrents, but still the bonds of history are very strong.
What does this mean for the current French government? I mean, they're already quite beleaguered. This seems to push in more, in a sense, more volatility into the system.
Yes, you see, France has had a problem that goes back decades. The fact is that the French Republic was in a very, very bad state in the 1930s when the Germans attacked, when France and Germany got into war with each other. And when France recovered its independence, first under American British tutelage, you know that there was an American occupation government for some time called AMGOT. Then with General de Gaulle and other freedom fighters, France regained independence and eventually walked out of NATO. And that has been quite a sore point for the Anglo-Saxons, for NATO, but particularly for Americans who run NATO, because they regarded France as a sort of a breakaway, you know. And then, as long as the French Republic was prosperous, even though it had lost its colonies, it managed to keep those connections with a number of African and Asian countries, which helped France to remain or become even more prosperous, because they obviously had the first right of refusal on many of the natural resources and also on the markets in Africa and in other parts of the world. So that gave France an influence, essentially a much larger influence than what its actual size and population would warrant. And however, with the change of the world economics and the relative decline of the West and the turmoil in the US and the great amount of rethinking that's taking place in America about the relationship with the Atlantic community, with Western Europe, France felt increasingly isolated. And I think the breaking point, if you want to go back into history, came after 9/11, when the US decided that they wanted to attack Iraq for the second time and conquer it. And France, under the leadership of Chirac and the Prime Minister Villepin, who are both, by the way, in some way old India hands, if you want to, give them that sort of background in a way, they decided not to go along and to align with Germany and Russia to oppose the American policy towards the Middle East. That was, of course, a very big breaking point. And at that stage, you could see America deciding to punish France and change its political system. And the change in the political system took place in the waning years of the Chirac administration, because Chirac was, of course, seen as responsible for walking out of the American embrace, if you want to call it that way. And there was what you might call a quite constitutional coup, in the sense that the French presidency was shortened from 7 to 5 years. The French president's powers were limited, and Sarkozy, who was the American candidate, came to power with heavy American backing. Sarkozy has a history with the CIA that goes back to his family and to his teenage years. In fact, there are stories that he basically entered politics under American patronage. And therefore, his first move when he became president was to fly to Kennebunkport to meet with President Bush. And he publicly expressed regrets for France not having participated in the Iraqi invasion of 2003. So that created a split in the French political system, because there was a great deal of resentment that Sarkozy was selling out on the French tradition of independence and relative non-alignment, and was becoming, bringing France into the American League, into the American alliance, to the point that he rejoined NATO, and then was eager to participate in the subsequent American adventures. Now, that has led to a great deal of division. Sarkozy was accused of corruption. He defended himself and was found to be not guilty, although there was some real suspicion about that verdict. And he could not get re-elected. He lost the next election and was replaced by a socialist, Hollande, who did not change very much the policies of France, but who tried to be a little more distant from the US, although I think that was more of a show than a reality. So as a result, now you have a country which is split in 3 blocks that cannot agree, and therefore a government can no longer be formed. Macron is a lame duck president who doesn't have a majority and cannot manage to get the budget passed and cannot manage to have a stable government, because his prime ministers have lasted only a few months or a few days in the last year, simply because they cannot command a parliamentary majority. And by far now, the largest party is the National Rally, headed by Marine Le Pen. But there is a consensus among other political parties, left and right, that they should never form a coalition with the National Rally, because the National Rally is regarded, if you know what I mean, a bit like the BJP is regarded by the West, as a far-right party. So by much of the Western politicians. So as a result of that, there is chronic instability because the National Rally cannot form a government, has not been able to so far. And if it came to form a government, then with some minor allies, then that could also create such turmoil that the kind of disorder that France has experienced in the last few years might become a lot more acute. And therefore, many people are very afraid of that. They think, even if we don't mind the National Rally or if we think they can do some good things, number one, it would plunge France into potential chaos. And two, the European Union would crack down heavily on France for essentially taking its distance from Brussels and would regard the government as fascist, etc., etc. Now, Italy has gone through some of that in the last few years when it elected in a right-wing coalition headed by Giorgia Meloni. But, Italy is somewhat different because Italy has a long history of fascism, and many Italians are rather comfortable with fascism as an ideology. And then Italy maybe is not as critical to the Union as France is, and they made a lot of concessions. They have center-right allies who are moderating government policies. They even made some sort of an alliance with Israel to reassure the pro-Jewish forces that they are not against, they are not anti-Semitic, on the contrary. So all that in Italy to somehow coast along, even though they don't have a very comfortable relation with the EU. But in the case of France, there is a much stronger reaction to any suggestion of fascism because it is immediately seen as bringing back the days of German occupation and the French defeat. Because let's face it, France was defeated and occupied, and it was run by people who were in alliance with the German Nazis. So that brings back very, very painful memories. And that's why France has this psychological problem that it somehow, if it wants to be seen as respectable, it has to be on the center left. And even politicians who belong culturally and personally to the right, they are happy to show that they are also left friendly, or at least center left friendly.
Also talked that Marine Le Pen herself, I think she's been barred from contesting election. Was that correct? Will she also be jailed, do you think?
Well, could be, but then again, it creates a serious problem of precedent because one past French prime minister was found guilty of the same thing and was never really condemned for anything. So that would show once again that justice is highly politicized and that it judges people according to their ideology or the intentions that are they are credited with. In the case of Marine Le Pen, she was indeed condemned for using money from the European Parliament, therefore money coming from the European Union, for paying some of her campaign activities. But of course, that's a very ambiguous case because the members of European Parliament are given funding for hiring political assistants, administrative assistants, staff. And the staff is supposed to be doing parliament work, but not party work. However, how do you make a difference? If you are in parliament and you represent a party, how can you prevent people who work for you in the parliament for not doing work which is connected to the party? So she has appealed. And as a result of that, it was said that until she appealed, she could not stand for any public office. But obviously, the appeal has to be made, and then there has to be a judgment on appeal, which at that point will determine whether she is back in the race, whether she can run, or whether she is definitively condemned. If the condemnation is confirmed, then she won't be able to become president. Then she would have to have one of her lieutenants, like Mr. Bardella, who is only, if I remember right, 32, to run to become president if he were to be elected, which is still, in my view, a very, very problematic issue. But you never know, because the other parties in the last polls have actually crumbled. You know, Macron has something like 6% approval rating for his party. The far left is at 10, 11%. The socialists are at 5, 6%. And the center-right Republicans are again around 10%. The National Rally is the only party which is consistently above 30%.
It's true. You know, when you describe what you just described, it does seem like there are issues with the democratic structure. And from an Indian vantage point, where consistently Swedish organizations and this, that, and the other talk about problems of democracy, I wonder why such problems of democracy never pop up on lists made by such Swedish organizations and American organizations. Because what you're explaining in France is a problem of democracy. If a party with 30% of the votes and then everybody else with only single digit or maximum 10% of the vote, and that party which has 30% can never come to power, there is a democratic issue. After all, at the end of the day, democracy stands on elections.
Yes, that has been discussed and spelled out and argued for many years now, because the National Rally began its rise in the 80s, and it has never really gone down since then. There have been slight up and downs, but generally speaking, the trend has gone upwards. And now a lot of the French say that their sympathy lies primarily with the National Rally. You are talking about almost a majority of French people who are not afraid to say, actually, what I want is best expressed by what the National Rally proposes, which is the curbs on immigration, return to national sovereignty, limiting the powers of Brussels, perhaps even walking out of Brussels. There is a big debate about the euro. Should we walk out? Should we wait for the euro to break up? All these issues are very much on the table. So the fact is that we haven't noticed, but in the last few years, I wrote that in various articles, and I'm one of many who wrote that, or similar things, that we have entered a stage of post-democracy after 2000. And post-democracy basically is guided by national security, or, what in the case of the European Union, so-called European security. But it is also very much based on the primacy of the judicial order, which essentially means what the Americans call the, rules-based order. And that in itself looks very nice, except who makes the rules? There are some who make the rules and others are bound to obey them. And the underlying philosophy is a very Marxist-inspired.
Whose rules violations are accepted, and whose rules violations are negated?
That's exactly the case. So there is, at the base of this ideology, there is something which is definitely Marxist in inspiration, although you could go back to Plato, saying that there are some people who are above the others because they have a very good or a very virtuous judicial philosophy, and therefore they can decide what is right and what is wrong. And for example, being on the right wing, a nationalist is seen as generally bad, or at least dangerous. Whereas being an internationalist and a liberal with a strong socialist opinion is considered to be good. And as a result, the judges of, who are often making the rules, they claim to have the authority to cancel democratic election results by saying these people are bad, they are inelectable. They cannot be associated to power because they don't have the right ideology. This, by the way, is exactly what the European Union is proclaiming openly, saying that, if you want to be accepted within the European Union, you have to play by our rules and you have to accept our ideas. Otherwise, you are not fit to be in a civilized community. And that's what now the European Union is using against countries like Hungary, sometimes against Poland, now against Slovakia, and there will be others who will also be, who are already under the scanner. So as a result of that, you have a democracy which is essentially a controlled or guided democracy, where some people who are generally not elected decide what is okay and what isn't okay. Now, the US was very much like that under the Democrats, but now, of course, it's changed because of the Trump maelstrom. And although there is not always a lot of clarity about Trump, the fact is that now they have taken the conscience against the liberals and they want something else, which is not necessarily more respecting of freedom, because we know that Trump is very fond of sanctions against anybody who disagrees with him. But the fact is that he wants a different system, which is under the philosophy that he more or less belongs to, which is the philosophy of American hyper-nationalism, that essentially entails also imperialism in one form or another. You know, that we are the exceptional country and we do what we want because we are the strongest, and anybody should listen to us and do what we tell them to do. So that's where we are. And Europe is caught now in the middle between, growing forces elsewhere in the world, like China, and the US, which keep bossing over Europe and telling them you can't do this, you can't do that. And many European leaders are happy to accept it because they owe their power to American protection. So they are not going to go against the US. That is very much the case, by the way, of Macron. And he basically tried to stick together with the Americans, like the British do, even though there are now very serious disagreements between the Europeans and the Trump administration, simply because the Trump administration is unpredictable, uncontrollable, and sometimes gets out of the agreements that were made with regard to certain issues, such as, for example, the Ukraine war or the tariff issue, the free trade issue.
I wanted to come to a country that you just mentioned, Poland, which is going through a bit of an economic miracle in a sense, at least in terms of growth. Its growth has really soared. Of course, the magazines are calling it an economic miracle. I want you to talk a little bit about Poland, and how you see this transformation in that society, in that country, how it became growth-oriented, and how it began to display some of the highest levels of growth in the world.
First, I do not know enough about Poland to be making an informed judgment. I have been there. I have noticed, of course, the deep divisions within Polish society. On the one hand, you have a very nationalist right, which tends to put its hope in the US and in Britain, which in my view is rather misled. And on the other, you have a lot of Poles who are not happy with the way things are going, and they feel that Poland is playing too much Lone Ranger, is not willing to accommodate the European Union, and has made enemies on both sides. They are not in good terms with Germany, they are in very bad terms with Russia, and they are distrusted by other Central and Southern Europeans. So Poland is definitely a mixed success. I mean, I could see there was a fairly high rate of growth, but I wonder if this is not already coming to an end, because considering the decline in the neighboring countries, especially Germany, and considering the trade practical paralysis with regard to Russia, I think the energy crisis is hitting Poland like other European nations. They now have to buy a lot of a very expensive Norwegian gas and oil, and that certainly is not good for their economy. They are not at all energy autonomous. They depend on others, and since they would not, of course, agree to be buying energy from Russia, they have been very restricted in their supplies. And of course, on top of that, they have been fighting an economic war with Germany, trying to prevent Germany from getting cheap energy. That's been a long-standing fight between them. So, and now they are demanding, which the Germans are refusing to consider. And the Poles are saying, did you paid the Israelis, the Jews, why didn't you pay us? So all these issues have coming to the fore. So I do not see, frankly, a very bright future for Poland at this point. I think Poland has traditionally has a very belligerent attitude to its neighbors. And I think this is being repeated now. And as a result, they are having some serious problems at home, because a lot of Poles don't like what is happening. To give you an example, the Polish government was very supportive of Ukraine, but this has changed. And now there is in Poland, the dominant story is how atrocious the Ukrainians were with Poles when they massacred hundreds of thousands of them during World War II in order to sort of ethnically purify what was becoming Ukraine, which had not been an independent country before. So the Poles are saying, why do we help Ukrainians, where in fact Ukrainians are not friendly to us at all? And they are even creating a serious job problem in Poland, because a lot of Ukrainians have come in and have taken a lot of jobs. So you can see that I'm not I'm not so enthusiastic or optimistic about Poland. They have done fairly well because of their strategic position and because of a lot of support that they got from the US, which regards Poland as perhaps its closest ally on the continent.
So you're saying this story of its economic miracle, its very rapid growth, all of this might soon peter down.
Yes, well, it's inevitable. You see, Poland cannot be an economic miracle if it is surrounded by countries that are in trouble, whether Russia, the Central European countries. For example, Hungary has done relatively well, but that was due to the fact that it has cheap Russian energy and it has substantial Chinese investments. Now, the European Union's policy is to cut off the Russian energy supply and also to limit Chinese investments. So as a result of that, Hungary has already said that you are actually strangling us. You are cutting us down. And so you can imagine that if this happens to countries in Central Europe, Poland is not likely to be an exception.
Finally, my last question, Ko, looking at the situation today in France and other parts of Europe, now that the war in Ukraine has dragged on for so long, where do you see the next steps going forward for the EU? I mean, obviously, there's this big FTA with India that's been on the cards for a while. What do you think are the next steps for the EU?
The EU is facing a rather dramatic alternative because either they go on with the current policies of the Brussels leadership, administrative leadership, and then you can see more and more, conflicts with Russia and even to an extent with China, not military but economic, and also an attempt to enlist the US as a source of support, which the US is not really willing to be. And as a result, technically, the European Union, through the voice of Ursula von der Leyen, has already agreed to pay a heavy tribute to the US. If I remember right, 600 billion of direct investments in the US economy, even though one doesn't know how that will work because the European Union is not in charge of placing money on behalf of the states of the Union. And you also have the 750 billion energy cost that they have agreed to pay for very high priced shale oil and liquefied natural gas, which implies a lot of infrastructure construction and also high bills. So that is making the EU increasingly unpopular. And you can see both France and Germany, the leading countries, regularly protesting and refusing to accept some of the decisions. For example, France is technically under threat of massive EU economic sanctions because France has not been able to bring its budget in line with the EU guidelines. In other words, you have to have your budget down to, your deficit down to 3%, and France is still at 5 or 6% and cannot see how it will bring it down. And that's why the government cannot pass a budget because it's systematically opposed and motions of no confidence are voted by both the left and right to stop the cuts in social welfare being made. As a result of which, either the EU will somehow have to find a way of loosening the rules and telling countries, do what you can, and we'll just have to become more flexible, but that immediately weakens the euro, which in turn means that many countries will be looking for alternatives to the euros, and that's where the Chinese M-Bridge and other alternatives are becoming attractive. And so that would essentially mean a gradual, I wouldn't say necessarily a breakup formally, but a gradual loosening of the ties between the EU. And I think that's already happening. The other option, of course, is for Germany to somehow prevail, even though it's not in a great shape now. And in that case, it becomes a Fourth Reich, which I can tell you Europeans are worried about because they do not want German leadership and they feel France would be too weak politically and economically to stand up to Germany. The UK is already out. So in that case, Germany would be able to enforce rules, which they're already doing, by the way, with regard to Ukraine and other matters. And that, arouses very bad memories. Not that the German leaders are, Hitler. But remember, many of them have family backgrounds in the Nazi party. And, all memories die hard. I mean, it's easy to revive a certain way of doing things. And if you look at the way that Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, for example, is running the EU, you can't miss a certain amount of typical German authoritarianism. This is the way it is, and if you don't do it, you will be punished very severely. And that is something which obviously has created a lot of jitters. So that's what we can say about the possibilities in the future, or rather the perils in the future.
But always very, very insightful, great perspective to what's going on in Europe. Thanks very much for your time, Kom. No doubt we'll be back talking to you again as all these stories advance. Thanks, Kom.
All the best. Thank you.